All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the OVS VAP Training Center webinar, Creating a Trauma-Informed Environment for Children. I'm Blake Cush, the Director of Training and Outreach at OVS. And we've said this many times before, we understand that programs really are under some unique forms of stress during this time, and today's webinar is the 7th in our Resilience webinar series, which was developed with the goal of helping you tackle some of these pressing issues. I'm actually happy to share that this Resilience webinar series has had over 1,500 attendees, and it has been highly successful. We have a full list of all the webinars on your screen in front of you. You can also register for next week's 8th in this series. And if you go to ovs.ny.gov/training, you can access all of the previously recorded ones as well. Today's will also be recorded. Those links are available on that training webpage and also published to our YouTube training channel. Please take advantage of the resources that we put out there for you guys. They'll be up there for quite some time, and we encourage you to check them out if you haven't seen them yet and to share it with your colleagues. We'd also like to take this time to remind you that we're offering increased access to our consultants from the OVS Training and Technical Assistance Request Program, or TARP, through individual and small group coaching sessions. Again, you can learn more and access those free resources on the same training page. Again, those really are free resources, and our TARP program is still open and running. It might mean we don't do as many in-person things during this COVID-19, but there are still plenty of free resources and lots of training available to you guys. So take advantage of them if you haven't done so already. And finally, as you exit today's webinar, you'll be directed to an evaluation survey on the presentation. Take a couple minutes. I think it's 11-question survey, and it should only take you a few minutes to complete. We really do use that feedback in improving any of our future training offerings, and it's also shared with our presenters, and they really do appreciate it. So please take those couple minutes and help us out. So today's webinar will be led by Dr. Amy Nitze, the Director of the Institute for Disaster Mental Health at SUNY New Paltz. Dr. Nitze is a psychologist who specializes in providing mental health training in academic and non-academic settings, both nationally and internationally, with an emphasis on disaster mental health and trauma recovery. She's currently collaborating with UNICEF USA to develop and implement a program of mental health support for children impacted by Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. Amy is the author and editor of numerous publications, including the recent book, Disaster Mental Health Case Studies, Lessons Learned from Counseling in Chaos. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Amy Nitze.
Good morning. Thanks, Blake. Good morning, everyone. Can you guys hear me okay?
Gotcha.
Okay, awesome. So thanks for taking the time to attend today. So as Blake said, the topic this morning is going to be about how to create an environment for children that can support them as best as possible in terms of mental health, promoting their resilience and helping them recover from the target today is around COVID-19, but these strategies and principles that I'm going to talk about today are really applicable to any child who's been impacted by a trauma or an extremely stressful situation. And so I'll spend about the first half of the hour talking about how trauma impacts children in terms of how it impacts their brains, how that then manifests in terms of different symptoms you might see manifest in children, and then what are the external factors that influence how severe the children's reactions might be. And then I'll spend the second half talking about principles for creating a trauma-informed environment and then strategies for implementing those principles. And then hopefully we will have some time at the end. We will have some time at the end for you to ask questions or for us to engage in a discussion about that. So with that, let's get started. I just want to kind of frame today the first part of this discussion about the ways that trauma impacts children by emphasizing this fact that trauma-related behaviors make sense when understood in the context in which they arose. So even though they might seem like they're causing the child some problems, or they're causing problems at school or at home, they're actually adaptive responses to terrible situations. And so if we can tease out why the behavior is arising, it makes it a lot more, I don't want to say easy, but it's a lot easier to understand what purpose the behavior is serving, and then to create a response that is adapt more effectively So I just want to do a quick overview of the brain and how trauma impacts the brain. And in order to do that, for purposes of today, we can think about the brain as having two different parts. So the emotional part of the brain, or the back part of the brain that develops first, that's actually developing in early childhood and in childhood, is the part of our brains that protects us, is designed to protect us from danger by sort of serving as our alarm system. So it helps us decide quickly when we're faced with a situation, if that situation is dangerous or not, and then motivates us to do something quickly to protect ourselves. So it's really intended to help us survive, and in that way, that's a very adaptive process. So it makes quick decisions. It has to, right? It perceives something dangerous, and in order to protect us, it has to make a quick decision about whether it's dangerous or not. But the trade-off of that quick decision-making process is that it's not super fine-tuned, and it can make some mistakes. It can overgeneralize. It's not super precise. Then the rational part of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex or the neocortex, is the part of our brain that then helps us interpret the experiences that the emotional brain picks up on. So it helps us look around and understand and make meaning of what we're seeing and what we're experiencing. Importantly, the rational part of the brain also regulates our executive functions. And so these are things like planning and decision-making and thinking through the consequences of our actions, being able to put a sequence of actions together and understand how that flow will work. And this part of the brain is still developing in adolescence. It's still developing even in early adulthood, probably at least up till age 25. And so this part of the brain works more slowly than the rational part of the brain. It takes longer to make a decision or to come to a conclusion, but it's more fine-tuned. It's more precise. Okay? So the emotional brain and the rational brain. Now we're going to talk about how those play out in terms of trauma. So a metaphor that I really like for understanding this process is by Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote a really good book on this topic. And he talks about the metaphor of the smoke alarm and the watchtower. So the emotional part of the brain serves as the smoke alarm or the smoke detector. So it detects a potential threat in the environment, such as a stressor. And it sort of sets off an alarm. It sets off the beeping sound like the smoke detector in your house does. Then the rational part of the brain sort of serves as the watchtower. So it examines the threat. It sort of looks out over the environment, decides whether the threat is an actual threat or a false alarm. Is the house really on fire, or did something just smoking that was left in the oven too long, something like that. It makes a decision about that, and then it activates a plan for responding accordingly. So if the house really is on fire, the rational part of the brain or the watchtower is the one who says, the house is on fire, we need to get out, or I just need to shut off the oven and open the windows. Once the rational part of the brain has made that decision, then the smoke detector can go back off. So the emotional part of the brain can return back to baseline and continue its monitoring function for the next dangerous situation that comes up. So this is happening to all of us on a daily basis, on a regular basis. And in daily life, the way that we manage stress relies on a healthy balance between those two parts of the brain. So they work together in balance in the way that I just described, in a way that allows us to notice stressful situations or dangerous or threatening situations, make a plan for responding accordingly. But with traumatic stress, traumatic experiences are experiences that our brains weren't necessarily designed or wired to be able to handle. And so they overwhelm our brain's ability to stay in that balance that I just described. So it's as if the smoke detector or the smoke alarm gets stuck in the on position. So if you imagine, or maybe you don't have to imagine, I'm sure this has happened to a lot of you, the smoke alarm goes off in your house and you can't find where the danger is coming from, or where the sound is coming from, or you can't get the battery out of the smoke detector. So there's just beeping sound going off, and it becomes very distracting, and it's hard to just continue on with your daily life until you get that smoke detector shut back off. It's the same in our brains. So when a traumatic experience happens, the smoke detector, the emotional part of the brain, it's as if it gets stuck in that on position, and it overwhelms the cognitive or rational part of our brain's ability to do its functions. So the rational part of our brain sort of goes offline, and all the brain's attention, all the body's attention really gets focused on trying to shut off the smoke alarm. And that happens at the expense of the other brain functions. Okay? So Van der Kolk, who describes this metaphor, says it this way, which I really like. After trauma, the world is experienced with a different nervous system. Its energy is focused on suppressing the inner chaos and avoiding new threats at the expense of living in the present. And so he's describing that experience of all the brain and the body's energy sort of ceasing their regular functions, and it becomes sort of an all-hands-on-deck approach to trying to get the smoke alarm, that annoying, terrible beeping sound in our brains, to shut off. And so that really does impact almost all areas then of how we function in the world. I'm saying we, this is true for children and adults. Our brains all work the same way. With children, though, because our brains are still developing, it has if we aren't able to help them get the trauma processed effectively and get their brain to function back in balance again, it really can have a negative developmental impact over time. So how then those experiences in the brain manifest in terms of trauma reactions or symptoms that we might see? These come in almost all realms of our lives: emotional, cognitive, behavioral, and physical. This is, for purposes of today, this is a really quick summary, but I'll try to do my best to elaborate here. So in terms of emotional reactions, the emotions that people can experience, that children can experience after a trauma like this, are really any emotion, from fear-based emotions, fear, anxiety, worry, to sadness, guilt, shame, to irritability, anger. So really it could be any range of emotions. And but often those emotions become very overwhelming. So it's whatever emotion it is, it feels overwhelming, it feels out of control. So it's as if you're feeling too much of whatever it is that you're feeling. The opposite of that, and that's pretty noticeable. When kids are having big feelings, as we might say to children, when they're having overwhelming feelings, you'll notice. They'll demonstrate that to you. But the flip side of that, when children are feeling the opposite reaction is a numbing reaction, where people can sort of mute their emotions or constrict their emotions, or even in this extreme form, this becomes dissociation. So we could say that children feel too much or they feel too little, and that feeling too little can be harder to notice because these are kids who aren't drawing attention to their behavior. They might look to the outside observer just fine because they're not externally emoting in some way. Another emotional consideration here is that the fear whatever the original fear was, can become reactivated. So this is when, the common way to say this is people get triggered. So whatever the original fear was can get reactivated in response to a new threat. And we'll talk about that more, what that means in the behavioral category in a minute. But the fear can also become overgeneralized. So the fear of one specific event, one specific traumatic experience can become overgeneralized to a hard to talk about example that I sometimes use here is if a child was involved in a school shooting and they were in the hallway of the school when that happened. They may obviously have a fear of being in that hallway, but then that fear in the brain can become overgeneralized, and then they start to have a fear of, let's say, all hallways or being in any hallway at all. That overgeneralization can really become crippling to people, because imagine trying to live your life without without walking through a hallway. So that overgeneralization can really be a big problem. And then also, in addition to feeling too much or too little, when the brain is when the balance between the emotional and the rational part of the brain is thrown off by a traumatic experience, people can become emotionally dysregulated. So the extremes of their emotions can come up and down and really become intense and then go away, or their moods can change more rapidly than they're used to. And that feeling of sort of losing control of your emotions or feeling dysregulated can really cause an additional layer of distress because you just feel out of control. Okay. For cognitive reactions, there are two different types of reactions here. And the first, the initial symptoms cognitively after a trauma can come from that, from the fact that the rational part of the brain has been hijacked or has gone offline because it's been sort of overwhelmed by the response of the emotional part of the brain. So all those things that I listed earlier, the executive functions that our rational brains help us do, like memory, decision-making, planning, concentration, all those essential functions for getting through our day, for being able to attend school or focus on our schoolwork, those kinds of things, become really disrupted. And so kids can have problems with, with learning or with attention, and this can, often get mislabeled as misbehavior or attention deficit disorder, something like that. The later symptoms, an additional set of symptoms can come from kids searching for an explanation for what's happening. So traumatic experiences challenge our basic assumptions, our beliefs about who we are and why things happen and to what extent we have control over our lives. I think we've probably all experienced that to some extent or another with the current situation of the pandemic, of the ways that we used to feel in control of our days and our schedules and our lives has really been thrown off. And so it's important to remember here that when kids don't have a reasonable, solid explanation for what's happening to them, they'll make one up, they'll fill in the blanks. And they do that in ways that often are to blame themselves, because that is a safer thing to do than to feel that there's some danger out there in the world. So kids will develop some sense of guilt or shame, or they'll develop some magical thinking that puts them at the center of the story as if they were to blame for the situation. Once they have those sort of irrational beliefs, if you want to call them that, they can then start to engage in behaviors to sort of make those things come true. So if they believe they are bad or they're at fault, then they can start acting that way and sort of eliciting that response from their environment. Then moving on to behavioral and physical reactions, a lot of the behaviors that you'll see, whatever range of behavior it is, the intent of those behaviors is often to try to manage the intensity of the emotions. So they're behaviors that are intended to help to try to shut off that smoke detector that's constantly going off in the brain. And that can look like things like avoidant behaviors. So to go back to the hallway example I was describing a second ago, they might, start to refuse to go to school or refuse to come out of their room if hallways become a very scary thing for them. Or they might do risky behaviors, or become really irritable. It's not about the behavior so much as the fact that even though it looks like misbehavior or, some intentional bad behavior, the meaning behind it is often an attempt to manage their emotions. Even if they're not able to, a lot of people, children and adults, aren't able to articulate that that's what's happening to them. Children especially can regress in different developmental areas to a previous level of development, and that can be particularly, so they can start acting younger than they are in one or more ways. That can become particularly upsetting or crazy-making to parents or to caregivers if they don't understand what's happening. And then children can also manifest a lot of physical symptoms if they don't have the words to put to their feelings. They can become manifest as, stomach aches or headaches or other vague complaints. Also, sleep disturbance is a big one, and hyperarousal, so that sense of always being keyed up or always being overstimulated or always sort of hypervigilance, always looking over your shoulder, waiting for the next bad thing to happen. So all of these are possibilities, and obviously any individual child is going to may have some combination of these that looks very different from another child. And I want to spend a couple of slides here now on what are the characteristics of the environment that can cause children to have a more extreme negative reaction to a traumatic event. So obviously, I think we all know that different kids can experience the same event and be handling it in very different ways. And so what are the factors that contribute to how well or not well is a child able to do after an event like this? And so the one in the middle is the dose of the event. So how much of the traumatic event did they experience? So how big, how bad, how much of it did they experience? And in the current context, it's sort of hard to quantify. How long have they been out of school? What has it done to what is the being at home done to other areas of their life? Has it changed the level of, I think one of the things we're all aware of is the risk for domestic violence or child abuse is going up as people are locked in together. But also, have they lost someone? Have they lost more than one person? So what are the actual experiences related to the traumatic event that the child has had? And the one on the left, compromised support system. So we know very clearly from an empirical perspective that social support is directly related to positive outcomes. So the more support that people perceive that they have, the better they're likely to do. So if this event or any event has not only impacted the child, but put their support system at risk in some way or separated them from their support system, they're more likely to have a negative outcome. Similarly, what are the resources in their environment that are available to help them recover? So I think this almost goes without saying, but the fewer recovery resources in their environment, the more likely they are to have a negative psychosocial outcome or outcomes. And but the good news is that the support system and the recovery resources are things that any of you who work with children have an opportunity to help with. It's also really important, I sort of started to talk about this already, but it's important to think about how the traumatic event itself has created an additional layer or layers of secondary stressors in the children's lives. And the most important one is probably how have the caregivers been impacted? And has it changed their relationship with their caregiver? How well is the caregiver himself or herself functioning? What is their relationship now like with the caregiver, and is the caregiver available physically or, psychologically? And I think this particular situation has put a lot of stress on the relationship between the caregiver and the children. I've heard lots of stories of, kids whose parents aren't available physically or psychologically, who aren't functioning well themselves. And so this is one of my biggest concerns about how the current situation is going to end up impacting children. And then relatedly, do caregivers feel capable of handling the child's reactions? Do they understand them? Are they able to manage their own reactions enough that they're able to support their children? Those are big questions. And then do caregivers perceive that they have the resources and support that they need? And then how is the situation or the event changed other aspects of the child's lives? So relocation, separation, children forced to take on new responsibilities, caring for younger children, having to feed themselves or monitor their own homework, monitor their own school schedule because their parents aren't available to do that. And then in what other ways has there been disruption in the child's life? Certainly we know with this situation there have been lots of different kinds of disruptions. And as I mentioned a minute ago also, to what extent has the event increased their exposure to conflict or abuse or other difficult situations. So this is another slide that shows a variety of factors that influence the intensity of a child's response to a traumatic event. And if you look carefully at these, there are several that are things that you as a service provider can't do much about. These are characteristics of the child or characteristics of the child's history that are beyond your ability to influence. But the quality of the post-trauma environment is an important one, and it's one that you absolutely can do something about. And so that's what we're going to spend the rest of our time today talking about. So we'll start with the principles of a trauma-informed environment. So these 5 factors were identified by 20 of the world's leading experts on this topic who got together in 2007 and reviewed all the available research and all the available clinical experience and clinical wisdom that they could bring to the table, and said, what do we know about what people need in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event? And these are the 5 principles that they came up with. And when I teach this material, I often say that this is the most important slide in the presentation. So if you don't remember anything else that we talked about today, if you can remember these 5 principles, and if as you're designing your response for children or the environment that you're creating for children, if you're moving toward these 5 principles, you're on the right track. So we'll talk about each of them in more depth, but they're promoting a sense of safety, promoting calm, promoting connectedness, promoting efficacy, and instilling hope. So the first one is promoting safety. The goal here is to provide a sense of real and perceived safety that allows children to begin the process of healing. So one of the things that relates back, how this relates back to what I talked about the brain, is that when that alarm system is going off and people don't feel in their brain, when they don't feel safe, because the emotional part of their brain is telling them that they're not safe, that alarm system is going off and off and off. You can't, children, no one can recover when they're in that state of alarm. And so creating a sense of safety enough so that the brain's alarm system can start to shut back off is really the first goal. I put something called the continuity principle down there, which I think relates to this, to the sense of safety. It actually relates to everything that I'm talking about today. But the continuity principle is that because trauma disrupts how we understand our world and how we live our lives, responses should focus on restoring and maintaining the continuities in a child's life. And so routines and structure and predictability are super important, because those are the things that traumas by definition disrupt. And so the more kids can experience something that feels predictable and routine, the more they're likely to feel safe. A related way to help them feel safe is to protect them from ongoing reminders of the disaster. So this is about monitoring, limiting the amount of media exposure that they have, social media or otherwise, to constantly being reminded of it. And I know in the current environment it's hard to do that, but whatever you can do to help children disconnect from that for a while and focus on other things will also help to promote safety. Safety is important in the immediate aftermath of an event, or in the case we have right now, during the event, but it's also will come up again during points of change or points of transition. So as children go back to school, those kind of events, as they go out and go to a restaurant for the first time, those kinds of things, those points of transition are going to be times that will evoke the threat or the fear again. And so thinking carefully about how to structure and promote safety during those times is important. Very closely related to a sense of safety is promoting a sense of calm. So the goal here is to reduce the overactivation of the emotional part of the brain or deactivate the fight or flight response. And the related goal is to help children develop a range of soothing and emotion regulation strategies to be able to help themselves calm down. So we not only want them to feel calm, but we want them to regain a sense of control or efficacy, which is, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, so that they are able to, they know that if they start to feel dysregulated, if they start to feel overwhelmed or out of control, they know, they have the belief that they have the ability to regulate that, which is a really powerful developmental task or developmental achievement that kids need anyway. And in this environment or in the aftermath of a disaster, it becomes even more important. So one of the most important ways that you can do this is by modeling calm yourself. So we now know that there are mirror neurons in the brain, whereby our brains are designed to mirror the emotions of the people in front of us. And so when you're with a child, if the child is very agitated or very out of control and you're very calm, one of two things is going to happen. Either the child is going to, as you sort of remain calm in the face of the child's agitation, the child can start to mirror your sense of calm and slowly sort of calm down, stop spinning. Or if you're not feeling particularly well regulated yourself, you might just become agitated and mirror that agitation or anger or whatever emotion it is that the child is experiencing. And so one of the important things here is to take good care of yourself and make sure that you're able to feel calm and feel safe so that you can stay in that place and model that for the child. Using soothing strategies in the environment, like calm music, that kind of thing. And then also, really importantly, actively teaching children emotion regulation strategies like relaxation and mindfulness. I'll talk a little bit more about that. The third of the 5 principles is promoting efficacy. And the first, there's 2 aspects to promoting efficacy. The first is personal efficacy, and the second is collective efficacy. So personal efficacy is a child's belief that he or she is capable of exerting control over or mastery over his or her environment, or achieving desired outcomes or overcoming challenges. And that is something that, again, it's a developmental task. All children need this, but disasters and traumatic events strip that away. And so helping children reestablish that sense of mastery over their environment is really important. Relatedly is collective efficacy. So the child's belief that their group, however you want to define group in this context, is capable of overcoming challenges through coordinated action. So ways that you can do this are by intentionally teaching self-regulation and coping skills. How do they self-soothe? How do they problem solve? So there are emotional strategies for this, but also cognitive strategies like problem-solving steps, that kind of thing. Also creating opportunities for age-appropriate autonomy and choice and control. So what are things that are appropriate for children to be able to make decisions about, and then let them make those decisions. And then finally, just overtly and intentionally communicating trust and confidence in the child's strengths and their ability to overcome challenges. And the last one I have listed here is altruism. So giving children the opportunity to feel helpful and to support others promotes mastery and confidence. So an easy example in the current environment is allowing them to, make masks for other people, that kind of thing. But when they can feel like they are contributing to the overall effort or to helping other people, that helps develop that sense of efficacy. The next one is promoting connectedness. And I highlighted this earlier as we know that there's a great deal of empirical support for the relationship between connectedness and outcome after a disaster. So what we're trying to do here is combat the negative impact of the social disruptions that have occurred. In the current context, that's around school closings and all the other ways in which kids have been separated from their usual support network, their teachers. And so what are some opportunities for children to maintain or reestablish a sense of cohesion and a sense of belonging? This is a challenge. I know everybody is trying to figure out, all teachers and schools are trying to figure out ways to maintain this sense of connectedness virtually. A couple of examples of organizations that I'm working with are the Girl Scouts at the national level are doing these fireside chats. So they're doing these times when girls can log on and they're just having chats about different topics that are just short 15 or 20 minute things, like they all cook together one night, those kind of things. And UNICEF USA has developed this series of short kid videos targeted for children. They're called Kid Power videos, and they're narrated by LeVar Burton, and they talk about we're all in this together. And there's one that has a graphic of how we're all not alone, even though we all feel alone. I actually have links to those at the end of the presentation, so you can access those. So Blake, I am so sorry, but I forgot to plug my computer in, so I'm going to pause for 1 second and put this in so that I don't.
No worries.
Okay. The last principle of the 5 is instilling hope. And so the goal here is just like it sounds, to combat the sense of hopelessness that often follows a disaster or a trauma related to the disruption that children experience either in their life or in their relationships or in their future plans. I know that I have well, of course I know, but I have a child who's graduating from college this semester, and she had the ideal summer internship lined up, which has been canceled. Her graduation has been canceled. And so her whole plan, she worked so hard to have this plan for where she was going in life and where she was headed, and that has just been completely upended. And now she's living with, 6 or 7 other girls in an apartment and working at Kroger, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And she's very lucky to have a job, don't get me wrong. But it certainly has created a sense of hopelessness because it has disrupted, A, her sense of efficacy, and B, her sense of hope. So just an example there, but promoting the other principles that we talked about, safety, calm, efficacy, and connectedness, are going to contribute to a reestablishment or an installation of hope. Also, the restoration of regular routines and other evidence of normalcy will help with this sense of hope. Intentionally highlighting success, highlighting progress and growth, pointing out those things to children. And then continuing the conversation about asking them their goals for the future and then helping them make plans to achieve those goals in the new altered context that we're in. So no, it's not going to look like you thought it was going to look, but what else can we do to get you to your goal? That kind of thing. So those were the 5 principles. Now what I want to do with the rest of our time is just go through some strategies that you can use to implement those principles. So these are just examples. There's really no limit to the ways in which you might do so. And again, as long as you're targeting those 5 principles as you set up your work or as you do your work, you're on the right track. So one important strategy is offering children the opportunity to identify their emotions. So young children, as we know, don't often have words to put to their feelings, and helping them do so promotes that sense of efficacy, empowerment, mastery. So you can do that in a lot of different ways. Play feelings charades, do a daily how are you feeling today drawing or activity of some sort, and identifying how characters in stories might be feeling. So I actually have at the end, we have a resource slide, and I list 2 different children's books there that I think are really valuable for the current and usable in the current context. Children can often project their emotions onto a character in a book or relate to a character in a book in a way that they can't identify their own internal emotions, and so that can be a really useful tool. And younger children might be better able to identify physical sensations than emotions. So you can do things like use an outline of a person, like the one we have here on the left, and have them just color in where they feel different sensations in their body, things like that. So not only is the identification of emotions important in and of itself as a developmental task, but it really does help regain, it's a step toward regaining a sense of mastery and regaining a sense of emotion regulation. So closely related to identifying emotions are opportunities for self-expression. So self-expression promotes those same things of empowerment and mastery and efficacy. And when they're able to tell their story, it helps them gain a sense of ownership over it and integrate the traumatic event or the stressful event back into their lives in a more healthy way. It's important to remember that children might need to do this multiple times. So in play therapy, children might need to play out the same scenario in the sandbox multiple times, and you'll notice perhaps that over time the story starts to change. And so at the end, after a few times of doing the story, maybe the good guy starts to win instead of the bad guy winning, for example. As many times as they need to do it is as many times as they should be giving the opportunity to do that. And if there are ways for them to share that with other people, all the better. The third strategy is pretty simple and straightforward, but it's just validating children's emotions and thoughts. So we all benefit from having our thoughts and our feelings validated, even if there's nothing that can be done to fix the problem. So when children are able to identify their emotions and when they are able to express their experiences through play or through writing or through just talking, just reflecting back to them what you heard them say and expressing, reflecting back the feelings and expressing empathy can really provide the child with a sense of validation that helps reinforce that growth for them. So simple ways to start a reflection feeling or an empathy statement are just to say, so you really are feeling sad, or you're really feeling scared, or it sounds like you had a really hard day and you just are feeling upset, whatever it is that you hear them say. And I want to point out here that it's okay to be wrong. If you say, wow, it sounds like you're really feeling sad, and the child says, I'm not sad, I'm angry, that's good, because now you understand better, and also the child has had a chance to clarify that emotion for themselves, which is actually a really beneficial thing for them to be able to do. So just a note here that if children are wanting to talk or are wanting to express themselves, it's very helpful to be able to listen and validate, but they shouldn't be pushed to talk or to confront their memories if they don't feel ready to do so. When attempting to express empathy, here are some phrases that we recommend that you avoid. These are usually well-intended, but they often feel dismissive. So using sentences or using statements like don't feel bad or don't cry, telling someone to not feel what they, or to stop feeling what they're feeling just doesn't work. If that worked, the world would be a happy place all the time, right? And we wouldn't need therapists. But it doesn't work, and B, then there can add a layer of guilt to the child that they shouldn't be feeling what they're feeling, or there is something wrong with feeling what they're feeling. You also want to avoid changing the subject. When the child is wanting to express themselves, let them do that until it comes to a natural end. And then finally, you don't want to invalidate their experience or minimize their experience by saying at least, right? Like, at least you still have a home, or at least you still can see your teacher on Zoom. Those things are probably true, and there might be a time later for that kind of a reframe, but in the moment when a child is experiencing that or trying to express that emotion, using a phrase that starts with at least tends to minimize the child's experience and to not feel validated. So I mentioned relaxation and mindfulness earlier. So these are teaching kids these and helping them rehearse these are really, really valuable. So they help students by focusing on their breath, focusing on their body. It helps them regain a sense of control over their internal experience, which can really help with anxiety or other overwhelming feelings. And also when kids are relaxed physically, they're able to focus on other things like their work. So we put, these are, I didn't include any specific exercises here because these are so easily Googleable. There's a million of these out there, but one that we like is called the elephant and the fly. And so it goes through a whole series of things with kids where they close their eyes and they imagine. So to help them focus on different parts of their body. So one of them is imagine that there's an elephant sitting on your belly. And so they tighten their belly. They tighten their stomach muscles to protect them from the elephant, and then they release. And then you do that a few times. And then the fly is imagine that there's a fly landing in your nose. So they scrunch their face up tight, and then the fly flies away and they relax. So it's that. It's a fun way to help them focus on constricting and relaxing their muscles in different parts of their body. Related to relaxation is mindfulness. There is a lot of empirical evidence about the impact of mindfulness on kids and helping them be able to regulate their emotions, help them feel a sense, again, I've said this sentence a million times, but helping them gain a sense of mastery or a sense of control over their experiences, and really helps reduce overwhelming emotions. And we know now that even 2 minutes a day is enough to start seeing some benefit. And even little children can really be taught to do this. But it's really important for me to add here that this has to be something that's taught and rehearsed regularly so that kids can access it. If you wait until they're really distressed and then try to teach them this skill, it won't be as effective as giving them this as a tool that they can use at any time. And then when they're feeling dysregulated, they can call up that practice on their own. And then the next strategy is teaching them, giving them a range of other coping skills that they can use when they need it. So the goal here is that they have a range of ideas of things that they can do as they see fit when they're feeling particularly distressed. And you can help them develop a list. You can develop your own list and have it be a poster that's hanging in the office or hanging on the refrigerator at home or hanging in their room. But just, again, helping them feel like they have the tools to cope with whatever bad thing comes along. So it's not that they're going to avoid feeling distressed, feeling upset, but that they have some tools for dealing with that when it comes up. And then finally, the last strategy I have here is helping adults help kids. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the secondary stressors that are associated with children experiencing a traumatic event and then also having their parents be impacted by that same event and not be able or feel capable of helping kids really is another layer of stress and trauma for children. And so in the work that you do, what can you do to help the parents help their own kids? And that includes helping them know how to offer appropriate reassurance to their children, being able to answer their questions, and then providing parents with some psychoeducation about what they can expect in terms of the developmental needs of their kids during a traumatic situation. So offering appropriate reassurance. These are things these are things that you can help parents know how to do with their kids. So children benefit from being validated and from an acknowledgement that they've experienced something painful or stressful. And they also benefit from assurance that it's okay to feel what they're feeling, that their stress reactions are understandable, that there's not something wrong with them if they're feeling a strong feeling. And if this doesn't happen, if the significance of their experience or the significance of their pain or their emotions are downplayed, children might not feel like they have the permission to feel those feelings or to allow themselves to to feel what they feel, which we know they need to do in order to recover. So in doing so, it's important to remember that children lack adult perspective. So even for right now in the current context, even those of us who have lived a long time and have a lot of memories of before the pandemic and the shutdown happened, it still feels to us like, my gosh, we've been doing this, our whole lives. And so for kids who don't have our adult perspective of a timeline of life, this can really feel like these are permanent changes. And so they also lack adult perspective about the level of safety. They lack adult perspective about the source of the problem. And as I mentioned earlier, they can start to blame themselves if they don't fully understand the source of the problem. So helping them gain some perspective on the situation is important. But reminding them that even as they're scared or even as they're feeling anxious, professionals are doing all they can to help. And again, I've said this earlier, but helping parents know that it's helpful to encourage children to express how they're feeling, but not to push or demand it. Parents often ask questions about how to answer their children's questions, and so this is our best, these are our recommendations around that. Be brief and be direct. So answer what the child is asking, but do it briefly, and don't downplay it, don't minimize it. Be direct, but answer just what the child asked. So children do best when they absorb information incrementally. So answer what they ask, but no need to elaborate further. Children will take your answer, they'll absorb it, they'll process it, and then when they're ready for more, they'll come back and ask for more. Be truthful, be clear, use simple language. It's really tempting, I know, as a mom to distort the facts to minimize the facts, but that can really lead to problems later. And again, if you're ambiguous and you leave gaps in the information, the children will fill in those gaps, but in a child-centered way that probably won't be accurate and will probably be distorted. So really, parents can follow the child's lead here. A child's inquisitiveness can be the most useful guide to determine how much and when to share. And then this is sort of our list of general tips for parents on what to expect. And I think knowledge is power here. If parents understand what might happen and why it's happening, they're likely to be more patient and likely to feel more empowered to be able to respond effectively. So regression, neediness, acting out behavior, sleep disturbance, all the things we talked about earlier, parents need to be aware that those things might happen and that it's most likely not intentional misbehavior on the part of the child. Parents can also be reassured that reactions are most often common and temporary, and most children get better over time without professional help even. Healing will not be linear, however, so that's important to remind people that you might see progress and then you might see some regression again, and that can be really frustrating if you're expecting the recovery process to be smooth and linear. So encouraging patience, I know that's so much easier said than done right now, but encouraging patience and understanding while also validating for the parents how difficult this is for them. Things for parents to watch for in terms of what might be a red flag that professional help is needed are changes that get worse instead of better, play that is rigid and repetitive, and if they're playing out their trauma story in some way, if they continue to do that and the story doesn't start to change over time, that can be a sign that they're stuck in terms of their recovery. And then other extreme behaviors such as obviously threatening harm to self or others, extremely irrational thoughts or cognitive impairment of some sort, ritualistic behaviors, and dissociating are all signs that additional help might be warranted. Okay, and so the last slide we have here is just a list of resources that might be of interest to you. So on the left are two of the Kid Power videos that I referenced. These are about 4 minutes each. They're narrated by LeVar Burton. Who doesn't love LeVar Burton? He does a great job with the tone of his voice and the way he puts things in simple so I recommend those. 2 kids books that we use a lot in our work with children who've been exposed to a trauma are listed there as well. What I like particularly about the first one called A Terrible Thing Happened, is that the book doesn't name what the terrible thing is. And so it allows children to see themselves in the character in that story, regardless of the traumatic experience that they've been through. And then on the right, a couple other resources. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of relaxation and mindfulness exercises for kids out there, but one nice one is Headspace. So we put the link there for Headspace. And then the National Child Traumatic Stress Network is a great hub for all kinds of resources related to children and trauma, and they have most of their resources in both English and Spanish. So with that, I left us a few minutes here for questions, comments, anything you'd like to discuss.
Thank you, Amy. So before, I'm sure we might have a mini mass exodus of people who are butting up with 11 o'clock appointments. So I just want to thank you before we do some Q&A. Appreciate you and the IDMH team for putting together today's webinar. If you do leave us, don't forget to complete your evaluation survey and check back tomorrow morning. Most likely we'll have a recording to today's link published on the OBS VAP training page. And don't forget to sign up for our next week's Managing Performance Remotely webinar. That said, if you do want to stick around, we'll start taking a couple questions. And I saw one earlier, Amy, and I'm not sure if you have a great answer or not for this, but somebody asked us, what is the best type of therapy recommended for a survivor of trauma, or does it depend on the traumatic event?
So there are a few evidence-based models for children in trauma. So it doesn't necessarily depend on the event, but there are a few theoretical models that work. One of those is trauma-focused CBT, so trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy. That's well validated, and it can be done both individually and in groups. A couple other models, well, there are a lot of cognitive behavioral models, so anything that says that has CBT around it is probably a good choice. There are also models like cognitive processing therapy, narrative exposure therapy. Those are a few. I should have put a slide. I have a slide about that I don't have in this one. But look for something. I would recommend trauma-focused CBT as a good starting place. But you know what I want to add here, Blake, that the best predictor of outcome in terms of therapy with kids, in terms of therapy with anybody, is not the theoretical model, but the quality of the relationship between the therapist and the client. So regardless of theoretical model, if the child trusts the therapist and has a good working relationship with the therapist, that really is the best in terms of predicting outcome.
A lot of really positive feedback about how awesome you are. So kudos. I'm getting a lot of private messages saying thank you. That was wonderful. Somebody also agreed Tapping Solution is a great app for people with EFT, and it's easy for children to follow. Again, it's called the Tapping Solution. I wonder if you just search that in your app store.
I think it's a self-regulation strategy.
More questions about PowerPoint slides, and they are available on our website right now. We may just post. Rachel, will you send it again one more time in the chat feature? We'll send you a link. And then comments about the strategies for trauma being very helpful. So thank you. Rachel or Carla, Rebecca, you see any other questions that I might be missing?
Nothing on my end. I've just sent through not only the slide PowerPoint link, but also for those that are looking for the evaluation, it will pop up as you go to leave the meeting, but I've sent a link in the chat as well.
Great. Oh, I have another one here. Is there a way to keep children's mind off of this pandemic? It's a great question.
That is a great question. So, distraction is an okay thing in the short term. Just giving kids something else to focus on, whether that's, a book. This is a really nerdy thing, but I started a book club with my kids and my nieces, and we do a Zoom book club every Tuesday. So every night we do a chapter of the book just to have something else to focus on. So distraction is okay. But, the mindfulness strategies that I don't want to sound like a broken record about the power of those strategies, but mindfulness strategies are really about that process of acknowledging that you're having those thoughts or you're having those worries, but letting them come and go. Let them sort of, like, one analogy that I like is that your thoughts about any specific situation are like leaves in the river. And so as the leaves are floating down the river, you can just let them float on by, or you can try to grab them all and pick them up and hold on to them. And so we want kids to think about them as leaves in the river that they notice, but they just let them float on by. So those are the kind of mindfulness techniques that you can teach children, so that it's not that you're going to prevent them from having the thought, but that they're not going to grab it and hold on to it and worry about it.
Okay, we're getting quite a few more questions.
Can I, before you move on, Blake, do you mind if I just add something to that?
Of course.
And Amy, if you don't mind. So this is Karen Livermule, and I'm the Deputy Director for IDMH. I've been monitoring in the background. Great job, Amy. I just wanted to add to that a reminder to parents and caregivers to limit your own media exposure, and because that often results in limiting children's media exposure. I know we all want to be keeping track of what's going on, but if you have the television on all the time in the background, or you're scanning your phone all the time and looking distressed because of what you're seeing, your kids are going to pick up on that. Even if you think they're too young to really understand, they're going to get your emotions. So that's another good way to just, keep yourself from ruminating and dwelling on it, and that's going to have a trickle-down effect to kids. I think that's always important to keep in mind.
And Carla, if I can jump in on that as well. So for, the grade schoolers and the middle schoolers, I've got kids who are, their instructors or teachers are assigning homework and work related to COVID, because it's a great way to, take the now situation. And so my recommendation of that is, you don't really know, unless you're monitoring your kids' schoolwork pretty closely, just how much exposure they're getting. So definitely, when it's school day off, consider a kind of no media plan.
If you do address it too, I know our school I have 2 young children as well, and our school sent out a coloring book that was from the CDC, I believe, and it was, just sort of touching base on some of the general information, but tried to inform but not scare. And I think if you do want to have those conversations with your children, that was a kind of a good starting point for us.
Awesome.
I have a few more in here. Any chance you could provide examples of how parents can be brief when asked questions from a child about abuse? So many times parents get stuck or don't know how to talk to their child.
Can you read the question again? Provide an example of a way to be brief when what?
Asked questions from a child about abuse. And the comment after was that so many times parents can get stuck or don't know how to talk to their child. It's a good question.
It is a good question. I have to think of a scenario real quick. So if the scenario is, I don't know. It depends on what the question is. But so a way to be brief would be to say, what he did was wrong. What he did was bad. He should not have touched you in that way, or he should not have hit you. That was wrong, and you're going to be okay. Something like that. I don't know if that gets at it. Totally, the example has to depend on the question that was asked. In the context of the current situation, answering the questions such as, be time limited. So today, what we need to do is this, or the rule right now is we all have to wear a mask, and try not to do something that takes a really long time frame, because kids don't think in that way, and that can cause a lot of distress.
any strategies for teaching kids about social distancing?
You guys are stretching me.
My daughter asked us if we could wrap her in a blanket so she could hug Grammy.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, honey. That's a good question.
That's so sweet. You know, I don't know if I have any specific strategies. I think kids need to understand why, right? This is so different than you can't see this virus in the same way that you can see, you know, the results of a hurricane or, you know, something where there's physical destruction. So something that you can't see becomes something really hard for kids to understand. And so, but I really go back to the more that they can understand why you're asking them to do what they do, the better.
Question about any suggestions on how to work with kids with autism during this time?
Oh, well, that is, so those, autism is sort of beyond my specific area of expertise, but whatever the strategies are that are being used with that child around, you know, the behavioral intervention strategies, this is not the time to change those up. So change and times of change are particularly disruptive, I believe, for children with autism. And so whatever it is that you're doing, keep doing it, and you may even have to double down on those strategies. Whatever it is that whatever strategies they have for soothing, like the weighted blankets or the, you know, the sensory equipment. This is just the time to really stay in the routine of those things. That's really the best I can do.
Amy, this is Rebecca Rodriguez. I can jump in on this, not from a clinical perspective so much, but from a parent perspective of a child on the spectrum. So I think one is caregiver calm, right? Whatever the caregivers can do to make sure that they're taking care of themselves so that they stay kind of at a baseline calm and they're not heightening the stress of the child. The routine, as you know, if you work with kids of autism, is incredibly important. And so that routine likely has gotten disrupted. If it's a child at home, there's probably more people at home. They're not in the same group setting, likely. And so whatever you can do to kind of continue a routine or keep their old routine going. And then I would also say, you know, if there is an environment where there is more people around, wanting to make sure that there is a space that's a little more quiet and a little more subdued. So that's what I have to add.
Thank you.
Can you look into your crystal ball real quick and determine if moving forward as if social distancing and other regulations may be the new normal is actually a healthy strategy for coping with these changes? I guess the flip side would be, is that unhealthy to just assume that this is going to be our new normal?
So I think some of that is developmental, depends on the age of the child, right? So kids that are younger are really concrete thinkers, and so asking them to picture something as something that's going to be lasting for a really long time can be really hard for them. Older kids, older adolescents who have a more abstract reasoning ability can then be, you can engage them in discussion about that and how we might have to change our behavior moving forward in the long run. But for younger kids, concrete thinkers, I don't know that that's necessary. Staying really time limited, I think, is a better strategy, just developmentally speaking.
Somebody mentioned that and I know this is happening in a lot of communities, but that there are salutes being given to frontline responders. Every day at 6:59, I'm quoting now, every day at 6:59 I've noticed that my child and adults suffering from anxiety get tense around this time.
Yeah, that's like the media exposure thing that Carla was talking about earlier. We can put this in the category of developmentally appropriate choice. So if the kids are older, do they want to observe that? Do they want to participate in that, or do they not? and let them, that gives them some sense of regulation and efficacy about that process. Younger kids, I think at this point pulling them back from that, especially if you're noticing that it's causing anxiety. 100% I agree.
Oh, here's one. How can we promote safety while interviewing a child without intimidating?
I'm sorry, I was reading one that just showed up on the screen. Can you say that one?
Sorry, somebody asked how we can promote safety while interviewing a child without intimidating them, is what I presume they're asking.
Oh man, this is like forensic interviewing stuff that's beyond my area of expertise, but there are some really good resources out there on that topic. Do you guys have those resources, Blake?
We did a forensic interviewing training, an in-person training, and I might have some of it still. I'll try and dig it up, and I'll come back to this, and if I can track it down, any of those resources we shared at that training, I'll hyperlink them in the YouTube channel
Awesome.
for this video.
Awesome. The next one that I saw, the one I was reading, was about meditation exercises in Spanish. We do have a few of those that we used in Puerto Rico, so I will get you those, Blake, and you can put those there as
Great.
well.
Yep. I'm not seeing much else. Rebecca, Rachel, Carla, are you guys see anything that we might have missed?
Nothing new on my end.
Yeah, not mine either.
Or me, just a lot of thank yous.
Yeah, check out Carla's self-care webinar we hosted a couple weeks ago, and the psychological first aid. A lot of these topics intertwined. They're all on our website and published. You guys keep viewing them and sharing them with your networks. Yeah, we don't see much else coming in. Over 220 of you stuck with us through this Q&A, so we appreciate it. I hope it didn't make you nervous as the numbers grew and grew, Amy, as attendees.
I was trying not to look.
Yeah, but I can't thank you enough. We really appreciate this. Everybody, do your evaluations. Check back for some more information as we publish them, and we'll keep you posted with any other resources that come our way. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.